So next month, Tim is going to give a talk on encryption. It's basically going to be a primer on the various encryption modules that are out there. Kind of just showing you a little survey of them, if you will. So that'll be a very interesting talk. We're still looking for speakers for the month after that, but at least we have that one scheduled. So if you have a talk that you would like to give, even if it's a short talk, 5-minute one or whatever, that's fine. Let me know and we'll get you put on the schedule. Likewise, if there's a topic that you are interested in and want to learn more about, let us know that, and somebody will do a talk on that for you so that you can learn more about that module or that whatever.
I owe you one on Jenkins.
You're going to do one on Jenkins?
Yes.
That's her plan.
All right. So can I put you down for May?
Yes.
All right.
Awesome.
So Dorothy is going to officially do a talk on Jenkins in May.
Yes.
Yay. All right. So all of a sudden we have the next 2 months scheduled. I'm so happy.
Are you going to Canada in June?
I'm going to Canada in July, so I
you'll
will
get to do June.
I will probably do June unless somebody comes up with something. So.
Ooh, Canada's good.
What's that?
Canada's good.
Canada is, well, we'll see if it's good.
Where's Canada?
I'm going up the east coast of Canada doing a cruise with my wife.
He did not invite the rest of us to have the
Man, what is wrong with you?
Oh, man.
It's not the old Pearl cruises.
We'll just hang out that one day.
I think only Randall Schwartz is allowed to be on.
Yeah, we can talk Randall Schwartz into
hour.
with us.
In an hour, really?
Let's see here. Do we have?
Sarah?
I'll volunteer to sailboat.
All right, good. So tonight, I'm going to do a little talk about a module I just released to CPAN, I don't know, 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, called Chat iFly. This is a conversion from a Perl module, or I'm sorry, a PHP module.
From Pearl into Pearl. Okay, that was good.
Conversion from PHP into Perl. I use the word module kind of loosely. I don't know PHP, so I don't know whether or not there is a concept of a module, if they have that sort of thing, if they even have namespacing. This module has nothing that I would understand as a library, anything that you would use in any modern language, because I've used quite a few modern languages, and they all seem to have a concept of at least namespacing, if not some sort of a package structure. So this was an interesting challenge for me, because normally when I'm translating, like if I'm translating a Java class, for example, into Perl, it's fairly straightforward. It's already laid out. It's basically, you could almost write an automated conversion of it. But because PHP, or at least this module, didn't have any kind of coherent structure to it, you can't do that kind of automated thing. So it was a challenge, and it was interesting because of that. It made it, I had to come up with some strategies of how am I going to go about doing this conversion. So I wanted to share those strategies with you, and hopefully that'll help you if you ever need to convert from a module from one language to another, or a program from one language to another. And this should work for any language. Doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be Perl or PHP or JavaScript, Java, Ruby, whatever. It should work in anything. So anyway, so first let's talk about iFly Chat. So I wrote a module called Chat iFly for a service called iFly Chat. iFly Chat is a web-based chat system that you can install on your website. You don't install the service. It's basically a client library, that some JavaScript that gets installed on your server, that allows you to have a Facebook-like chat interface at the bottom of your website. Okay. The thing is, it also has a server-side component that allows you to do things like authentication into their server. So that's where the PHP part of this comes in. The problem with this service, it's a good little service, but the problem with it is that basically all of their customers are PHP-only customers, and more than 90% of them are Drupal only, because that's what it started out. It was originally called Drupal Chat, and then at some point, I don't know when, they renamed it to iFly Chat because they opened it up to things beyond Drupal. So I think now they have a WordPress plugin is the only thing that's not Drupal. Well, yeah, they have that in a PHP plugin. So, and now they have a Perl plugin because I wrote it. So the API basically authenticates users to the chat server. So I log them in essentially, and then they give me that little token, which I pass back to the JavaScript library so that it knows when it's communicating with the server that this person on my website represents this section of chat, essentially, so that they have an authenticated single sign-on, essentially. If they're signed into my website, then they're now signed into the chat server as that same user. So that's basically the authentication portion. You can also use it to manage guests, so that guests can log in, or not log in, but if somebody's just browsing your website, they don't have a login name, so you have to generate a login name for them. So that it allows you to do that sort of thing. You can say, guest Jeff is here, chatting right now. You can also use the API to toggle per site switches. So things like, do I want to have profanity filtering? What color do I want the chat to appear as? That sort of thing. And then we can also interact with the chat server API. I haven't done most of this because it's completely undocumented. So I have to have a chat with the guy that wrote it so that I can find out how it works. But I have a few of them in there just to test with it. But there's all kinds of crazy stuff. So you can obviously do things like post messages via the API. But you can also, they have concepts like inboxes, so you can have private messages that are saved for later and then the user can retrieve them. You can create and delete chat rooms, you can, all kinds of crazy stuff. But again, I haven't gotten into that very much, but that's what you do with the server-side API component. So the good stuff there, it's a pretty nice little chat system. It works great. Has lots of features, and so far my user base, we switched from an old chat service that is going defunct soon to this, and my users, the uptake has been phenomenal. My users switched transparently, they love it, and so I can't say enough good things about that. The code, the PHP code, uses long variable names, long function names, so it is fairly easy to read and remember where the hell you are. It's not like everything's ABC or something like that. So that's good. And the other thing that was nice is that PHP isn't all that different from Perl as far as kind of syntactically. It works very similar. So even though I don't really know PHP, it was fairly easy to do the translation. On the bad side of things, yeah.
Is there a particular reason you switched away from the old chat service? Is it not handling?
The old chat service is going defunct soon. They're going to go out of business at the end. The company that makes it makes a whole hell of a lot more money doing this other thing, so they've decided that they're going to shut down the chat service because it's sort of an annoyance to them. Anyway, so they're going to probably, toward the end of the year, they said they were thinking that they might shut it down, and I just needed to have something in place before then, so I just got right on it and went and found this. So that's why I switched away. So bad stuff about the library that they have. There's nothing dry about it. So dry is don't repeat yourself. So they repeat themselves all over the place. Like the default settings for any given variable, half a dozen places strewn throughout the code. There are several places where they reinvent things that they don't need to reinvent. But there's and I'll get into that as we go through this, but there's nothing dry about the library at all, which is sad. You want it to be, non-repetitive. You want to reuse the stuff. They wrote their own HTTP client and JSON, not parser, because they actually use a JSON parser, and that JSON parser is capable of converting like a hash or an array into JSON, but they decided not to use that. Instead, they manually output the JSON themselves, and I don't know why. At first I was thinking maybe they were doing something non-standard, but so my first test was simply to dump the data structure into JSON, Perl JSON, and see what would happen. and it worked perfectly. So created exactly the right thing that I wanted it to come out. So I have no idea why they decided to write their own export of JSON, but so that's a terrible thing, obviously. You want to reuse the good stuff that's tested and used by everybody rather than writing your own thing. So part of the library, there's like 300-400 lines of code in there that is just those two things that doesn't need to be there. So anyway. There's also a lot of legacy junk. This thing has been around clearly for a while. Like I said, it was Drupal chat originally, and now it's iFly chat. There's still a bunch of Drupal chat settings in there, which may still be important if you're in Drupal. I don't know. It's hard to say. And there's a lot of variable names that certainly just cannot change because of legacy things. You know, like in the JavaScript, it's expecting it to be it's expecting a div to be called Drupal chat. So you can't get rid of that because, you know, it was Drupal chat forever, long ago. But that's not what I'm really talking about here. I'm talking about stuff that is vestigial at this point. It is no longer used, but it is still in the library. And there's stuff that's, so I just basically, as I'm doing the translation, I'm figuring out whether or not that needs to be there to accomplish the goals of the chat service, and kind of just not translating that portion of it. So anyway, that's what I mean by legacy junk. There's very few comments and no documentation or tests of any kind in the PHP. I don't know if testing is as prevalent in PHP as it is in Perl. It certainly is in other languages like Ruby. There's lots of testing that happens there. In Java, there's lots of testing. Because I don't know PHP, I don't know if that's a core fundamental principle of the language, that people usually write tests with PHP.
BHAT.
What's that?
BHAT.
BHAT?
BEHAT is behavioral driven testing in PHP.
In PHP?
Yes.
Okay, so it is something that people normally do with PHP is write tests.
It exists. That doesn't mean people normally do it.
Yes.
It exists. That's good point.
exists.
Very
Okay.
good point.
Okay.
Very
Could
good point.
predate that.
Very good point.
No, this PHP library was actually written 9 months ago.
Oh, really?
Right. So now they had a Drupal library, which is a different thing, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But the PHP library was written 9 months ago, and they recently just came out with a new edition of it, which turns this procedural code into a class. Not in a good way, but it does that. It basically just literally converted the procedural code into a class without actually refining anything. But they're on the right path. I assume that because they went to a class, eventually they will, try and refine some of it. But anyway, no, is that a bad assumption? All right. Well, why would you go to a class in the first place if you don't plan on
Isn't that where you would just put package in front of the name?
It's essentially what they did, yes.
Buzzword.
Yeah. So anyway,
Buzzword.
that's unfortunate that it didn't have any documentation or tests, because when you're translating something that you don't know anything about, having those references would be a good useful thing, so that you know that you're producing the same result as as you're intending to produce. And then the other thing I noticed about the library is that on their website they list all these amazing features that the chat is capable of doing, but the library has less than half of those as available switches that you can actually enable. So I was trying to figure out, how do I get all those cool features, or is that a Drupal only thing? Do you only get that, if you're doing that? So I started off by just translating this part, and then we'll get into how I go about getting the other features later. So those were the bad things. None of them are terrible. I can get around all this stuff. These are things that would have been nice, had they done. So I wanted to next just kind of give you an example of the PHP. I'm not going to go through it line by line, but I thought it would be interesting just to whip through it quick. So here is their PHP code in about 60 seconds.
Ouch.
So.
Quick fly through, is that? So while we're watching this,
Uh-huh.
after reading about what we were going to be hearing,
Mhm.
I ran across a link to an article about why PHP is bad. And this guy, he actually wrote a rather extensive
The
and
fractal
rather
of bad design?
detailed, yes, rather detailed article about why PHP is bad.
What was the worst?
And
But
it's
there's probably
worth,
one
it's
of
worth
those.
reading.
Isn't there one of those for every language though?
You know, there's a lot of that for every language, but this guy had some
Well,
really, really good points.
Yeah.
You remember
It's-
COBOL was supposed to die in the
Here they're
60s.
implementing the
It'll never
individual error codes from HTTP.
Yeah.
Well, it's a lot of that document is Perl made a lot of mistakes. PHP should have learned from them.
But instead,
Didn't. It just added a bunch of its own.
Yeah, PHP. Like,
So
track.
anyway, that's a portion of the PHP. Thought it might be interesting to at least look at some of that.
I
That's
saw
like
lots of
PHP.
Drupal references.
What's that?
I saw lots of Drupal references as they went by.
Yeah. So you know, you got this library. Where do you start when you want to do a translation? I mean, you just dive in and start line for line, copying and trying to translate it line for line, or, you know, I had to come up with a strategy of how to do this because it wasn't just like implement the class, because it wasn't a class. It was strewn across multiple files and there wasn't a particular structure. And like I said, the defaults were set in different places all over the place, so I wasn't sure if that was important or not. So I came up with a strategy, and this is the strategy. First thing is, can I identify any libraries that can replicate functionality here that I don't have to implement? And obviously, the two right off the bat is HTTP and JSON. I don't need to reinvent that. We have very good libraries all over the place in Perl for that sort of thing. So, but it turns out there wasn't much else that I could find a library for that would give me much, because a lot of this is just literally gluing into their system. So it's really about the protocol layer, and that's covered by HTTP thin in this case and JSON. There were a couple other libraries that I'll get into later, but they aren't so much replicating functionality that they had as it is adding functionality that they didn't have. So anyway. Next thing I need to do is probably create a skeleton, rather than implementing the actual code, create a skeleton of what I think this is going to look like, so that I, make sure that I have at least API feature parity. Identify the method names that I need to port over, the ones that aren't vestigial, and try to keep those named the same thing that they were named in the original module, so that way if anybody needed to go back and forth, you would have that. If there are any class properties that I need, I should try to identify those things that should be, like basically your settings, if you will. Do that. And I should mention with the, oops, didn't mean to do that. With the class properties, because they're not using a class, they don't have that sort of a concept. So what they do is they have a configuration file, which is weird to me too. I haven't seen this before, and it might be a PHP specific thing. The configuration file is actually a PHP file. It's not like an XML file or an INI file or a JSON file or whatever you might expect it to be. It's actually PHP is the configuration. It's just in its own file. So I don't know if that's is that a thing?
That's pretty normal.
Okay.
For
Yeah, it's
PHP,
pretty
yeah.
does that too.
Do they? Okay.
Who does that?
What's that?
Who does that?
Python, I
Oh,
believe?
Python.
Oh, do they? I haven't seen
So-
that in Python.
Yeah, I haven't done much with Python either, and not enough to where I would have used a config file for anything. But yeah, that was new to me. I didn't know. I've never seen people put. Usually, you don't want to put configs into code, but
They get hacked.
and there wasn't anything really in the config that needed to be in code either. It was all just name value, name value, name value.
Actually, the last place I worked, they did that in Perl.
Really?
They put
They
it
used
into
to.
.pm files.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was their
It used to
config
be more
files.
common.
Yeah.
It used to be a lot more common.
Okay. Well, anyway, that was new to me. So I just basically decided that everything that was in the config file was going to be a class property that could be, created. When you create the object, you'll instantiate it with all these things, and most of them will be optional. as basically, I'll default it to whatever the defaults are that are strewn throughout the code everywhere, and then it'll just be a class property that you can instantiate. And when you write your app, you'll do that using a config file rather than having it hard coded into there. Especially since I plan to put this up on CPAN, nobody can edit a CPAN module if I use that as the config file. So anyway, and then I figured that the next thing I need to do before I actually write any code is to write some tests that would run. I have to run the PHP code, figure out what the output is from the various method names or function names, subroutine names, whatever they're called in PHP. Figure out what the output of those is, and then write tests that will prove that the Perl code is actually generating the correct output from these methods that I was expecting. Because there weren't any tests with PHP thing, I had to figure out how to run PHP. So that was another thing for me. Anyway. So, and then finally, once I've done all of those things, then I can actually fill it in with functionality and make it all go. So that was my strategy. I think that should probably work regardless of language. You should be able to, if you're translating anything, whether they have tests or not, whether they have documentation or not, this should be a fairly sound strategy for converting something. And it worked, so at least in this case, it was sound. So I started with my skeleton with the libraries that I could use that would help me out. So like I said, there's HTTP thin, HTTP request common, and JSON are obvious choices to help me with all of the posting and getting and deleting and stuff that you have to do, just interacting with the server. I also decided to use the URI module simply because it's a little easier to manipulate URIs with that than just kind of concatenating strings together. A little safer too. And then of course I use ouch because I put exceptions in everything. And I used moo because I wanted it to be object oriented and I wanted it to be prettier than Perl's native objects. So moo is very lightweight. It's like moose except smaller, and so it shouldn't be too obtrusive for anybody that wanted to use this.
Somebody bumped the switch.
Every so often we get the musical
We'll
accompaniment.
pause the video for a moment.
So anyway, so yeah, moo. Everybody, who is not familiar with moo? Anybody here? Everybody, or moose? Everybody? Okay. So
I use
moo
Mo.
is it. What's that?
Mo?
Mo? Oh, mo is another. Yeah.
Better than M.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's really just an OO framework. Makes things a little easier to deal with than default Perl objects, and definitely prettier. I'm not going to reinvent this stuff. It's just that simple, very simple. Just no way. Nor am I going to manually, encode JSON if I don't have to. Why would you do that? And then exceptions are a good thing, of course, and I wanted a class rather than procedural code. So that's that. So then I had to go in and identify the method names that I needed to transcode into Perl. And, I went through, and there was a lot of stuff in there that I decided just not to bring over because it was either vestigial or it was, replicating the functionality that I'm now using modules to do for like HTTP and stuff like that. So these were the core pieces that I thought I should bring over. One big change with that is because I'm building a class that actually has namespacing, I don't need to put iFlyChat _ in front of everything. And I assume they did that simply because there would be collisions inside of PHP. Potentially something else could be called update settings. Right? But again, not being familiar with PHP, I don't know. I was just guessing at that. But since there was no namespace, that made sense to me.
It's a relatively recent addition to PHP.
Oh, there are namespaces?
There is a namespace capability in the latest version, I think in 5.4 or 5.5.
Okay, cool. So they're just not using the most recent standard or what have you. Okay, so That's the only exception that I used there, as far as, otherwise, other than removing iFlyChat underscore, all the method names are exactly the same, and variable names and things like that I tried to keep the same too, just in case either I needed to update the module, like later they come out with a new release that has some extra features and I need to be able to kind of translate that from one to the other, or if somebody else was trying to figure out how I implemented something, for debugging purposes. I just felt it was better to try and keep the names very similar. So then we get into the class properties, and again here, this is what I said at the beginning. I decided that everything that was in the config file was going to be a class property here. And so this is what Moo class properties look like. You just have a has, the name of the thing, and then some settings for it. So in this case, for example, API key is read write, and it's required. So you have to put it in when you instantiate the object. And then other ones here, I've got like defaults, for example. You don't have to, it's not required because there's a default value that will be set if you don't set it. So if you haven't seen Moo, that is most of what Moo is going to give you as a newbie user using Moo. That's going to be the thing that's readily apparent. There's a lot of other cool stuff, but that's the quick and dirty thing that most people are going to appreciate about Moo, or Mo, or Moose. So again, basically everything in the config becomes a class, and I can't stress this part enough. Because we're setting defaults in the properties when it becomes instantiated, I don't need to have pound 222222 all over my code everywhere. I think it was at least 6 different places in their code where they would have that property set. Every function name that dealt with that particular property would ensure that that value was set if it wasn't set, it would default it to that. And so, by having a class, you don't have to worry about that. A class with defaults, you don't have to worry about that. So this really helps a lot, saving on lines of code. So anyway, definitely do this sort of thing. If there's any time when you're building a class, this isn't even related to translating. If you're building a class, if you can default something, do default it. It's good for 2 reasons. One, when somebody else first starts working with your module, they have to do less setup work to get working right away with your module. Eventually they can override those things if they care about them. But they can get going right away without having to understand very much about how to use your module. The other thing is, it just adds some sanity to your module, because you always know there's going to be a value there, whether it's one that the user set or one that you set. There's always something there, so you don't have. There's a lot of little spaghetti code that you can get rid of because you always know there's a value in there. So anyway, I think that's very important. If you're building a class, default as much as you possibly can. So then, another thing that I had to do, or that I needed to do to help out users of this module, there's a lot of validation and stuff that they wrote a lot of spaghetti code all over the place, again, in every subroutine, checking to make sure that this thing was a certain thing. This one isn't the spaghetti code that is all over the place. I put this in for convenience. They require, if you put in a number 2, it has to be a string. It can't be an integer. It actually has to be represented as a string in JSON when it goes out, or their chat server will fail. It'll crap on you. So, and that wasn't obvious to me at the beginning, because in their code, it was just an integer typed in, and I don't know how. It was probably because that's how they were doing it with their own conversion. Now that I think about it, yeah. That's why they did their own conversion to JSON. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Hey, I figured that out just now. All right.
There's easier ways to do that than making your own JSON conversion.
Right.
Not in PHP.
Wow. All right. I was wondering why they. Woo! We figured something out. Okay, good.
Could have just handled it better at the server side.
Right. So anyway, It wasn't obvious to me because in the config file it was just an integer 2. And so when I put a 2 into my thing, it wasn't producing, or it produced valid JSON, but it didn't produce something that the server would accept. It kept crashing on me. I'm like, but this is exactly what you are outputting. Until I realized there were quotes on everything. And then I'm like, huh, all right. So I have to stringify everything. So I put this little, Moo has this great function, and Moose has it too, called coerce, which allows you to pass in a subroutine reference that will change that value in some way. It will manipulate it. And so in my case, I'm just stringifying that. So I created a reference to the subroutine up at the top there, and I just reuse that everywhere where I might need a number to be input and it needs to be a string. The other thing, this is where they had a bunch of, they had some spaghetti code at various places checking out to make sure that things were the right value. In some cases they did do it, in some cases they didn't do it. I felt it should be just everywhere. It should always do that. So their input their inputs sometimes, a lot of times, just it's a 1 or a 2, which is, it kind of threw me off at first until I got into some of the other features later. All the stuff that was in their PHP library, it was always a 1 for true or a 2 for false, essentially. And I'm like, what the hell is going on here? It wasn't true or false though, it's yes or no. 1 is yes, 2 is no. And I was like, what is this? And then in other places, they would actually use true and false as booleans. I don't know. Does Perl even have booleans? I don't think it does, right?
Not really.
No, just
there's
Boolean context, but
Yeah.
So, but in PHP they do. They have actual booleans and so when they get translated into JSON, it comes out as a true false because JSON has true booleans as well. So I'm like, so why do you use 1 and 2 in some places and you use true and false in other places? It doesn't make any sense. Until later, when I finally figured out how to use their more advanced functions, some of their advanced functions actually have values other than 1 or 2. It's 1, 2, 3, or 4 as a thing. So this is actually an enumerated list of things that you can choose from, and so now it all of a sudden started to make sense. If it was only a binary decision, they would often use true or false. If it was something where it was more of a selector, they would use kind of numbers, or if they plan to expand it later or whatever. So anyway, so I put in this validation, and we ouch, which throws an exception if the parameter doesn't match what we're expecting. It has to be a 1 or a 2 in this case. So everybody, that's pretty clear, right?
I see you used the smart match. Everybody know what smart match is?
So
Some people are
used
very.
it. That's pretty cool. I was just thinking
Yeah.
I gotta try that.
It's actually.
well, it's good for any.
Make sure you read the
It's
documentation.
deprecated now?
Yeah.
Well, it's experimental.
There,
yeah, it's not deprecated. It's
No, but there are people who want to get rid of it.
it's that
they
there's
want to
a
get
lot
rid of certain cases of it.
Yes,
They don't want to get rid of
and
all
for
of it.
very good
I
reason.
haven't
Yeah.
read a lot about it.
So let me get up here quick. So what we're talking about is this little thing, right there. So what it does, in the context that I'm using it, it says if this scalar exists inside this array reference, then it's true. Okay, that's what we're doing here. But that little operator there can be used for all kinds of crazy comparisons. It's not just for seeing if this value is inside this array reference. And because it can be used for all kinds of crazy things, there are a lot of people in the Perl community that want to get rid of it because it can do these crazy things that can result in very crazy results. So, but this is fairly universally accepted as a good use of that operator. So I use it everywhere because that is so much shorter and simpler and faster than the other ways that you could do that.
Like a grep.
Yeah, well, you could do a grep. There's listutil stuff that you can use to do that as well.
His in works pretty good.
But
I use that sometimes.
this is so much faster and simpler and shorter, and I don't have to load another module, and it's great. So I use it everywhere.
Which version of Perl is that required?
That will go in 5.12, I think.
Oh, is
Or
it that far back?
Is it 5.10 or 5.12?
I want to say 10, but I could be wrong.
But there was a big problem with 10.0 where I think it was that it wouldn't traverse through an array ref, but then 5.10.1 it would. So then actually a lot of people say always only use 5.10.1 or newer because of that slight variation in 5.10.0. So we actually got bit by that because in production we were running 5.10.0. But all our development machines at the time were 5.10.1, and then something happened only in production, not development machines. So that minor version made a big difference.
Clearly.
If people install your module and they're running an old version of Perl, we'll install it.
Yeah, but the module specifically requires, I don't know, 5.10 or 5.12, whatever it is the feature level that is required for this. All my modules, though, do that. I don't have a single module that is released that doesn't use at least 5.10, just because I don't want to. 5.8 is so damn old. It's just not worth it. I know there are certain people that can't upgrade for whatever reason. I generally find that to be a bullshit political reason. So if you want to use my stuff, then
I just
then upgrade.
upgraded a place to 5.88. To 5.88.
No, we have a couple customers that just came to us, new customers that we probably will pick up soon, that are running 5.6. So I understand, but no. If you want to use my stuff, you have to go 5.10 or above. Just because that is modern Perl, everything else is not. So, okay.
I'm just curious, did you happen to look into if there was a way to tell the JSON output to automatically quote it instead of having to force the
I think there is a flag.
attribute to the string?
Yeah, I didn't actually look to see if JSON would do it for me.
Okay.
I just once I figured out what was going on, I was like, well, we should just make sure that this is always the right thing.
That was my first reaction too. I was just curious if you looked into it.
Yeah, I didn't look. I did look. There is apparently a way to force. If you do a 1 and a 0 as a reference, it will make those true or false in JSON. So if I, 1 or 0 in Perl would be true or false, right? But if you do a reference to 1 or 0, that will become true or false, the actual true or false flags in JSON. I found that as a cool shortcut, but I didn't end up using that either. So there's a different way that I ended up using that is the JSON module actually exports true and false as constants. So you can just use that, and that's what I used when I needed it. So I'm sure behind the scenes it's just doing that array ref trick, but I don't care. It actually says true, false. So I figured that was more clear what was going on. Okay. So then we need to move on and write some tests to replicate the output. I'm not going to go through all the tests because you guys know what tests look like, but I went through just a couple here to quickly show you. This is something I do in most of my modules. Like 90% of the modules that I write and put on CPAN are wrappers around somebody's web service, and they all require an API key, and I don't want to accidentally check my API key into my Git repository. So I always make it an environment variable and make it a test. It'll fail the test if I haven't set that environment variable. So I thought that was a nifty trick or tip to give people that write web services wrappers. So that's why I included it in this. It's really has nothing to do with iFlychat. It was just something I do, and I thought other people might find that interesting. So anyway, so this is the biggest test right here in the whole thing. Getting the key. The key is basically when I've told the user, or when I've told the chat server that this user has authenticated and here is the information you need to know about them, like their name, their avatar, URL, that sort of thing, they will give me back a 50-character string or something. I don't even remember how long it is. But they will give me back a string. And or they'll give me back a JSON blob, essentially, that will contain, as one of the elements, that string. So the first thing that I need to do when I get this back is to make sure that that JSON blob is the structure that I'm expecting it to be, and that it contains key. Key is the name for the value that I'm looking for. Because I don't have a way to validate that that key is actually useful. It's just a random string of characters. So I can't like say, okay, this is a letter, this is a number, there should be a dash here, you know, any of that kind of stuff. There's no pattern matching I can do on it. So all I can do is validate the structure of the document that it's sending back. So this is really my big test, is if I get a key back from the server, then all the other stuff is working at that point. Now I have other tests in here too. All the precursor stuff that leads up to that is also tested. But this is really, when it comes down to it, this is going to be the test that really matters. Did I essentially log into the chat server? If so, woohoo! I did my job, right? So anyway, that's really what it comes down to. When you're testing something that wasn't really designed to be tested, like this, you have to go based on, like I said, I'm looking at the structure of the JSON document because I have no way to test whether that's a valid key. I can't actually use that key and do something on their service to see if it'll do anything, because that key is meant to be used by the JavaScript in the browser. So there isn't something I could call on their server and say, is this a valid key? So my test is
Well, that
just...
would be kind of nice.
It would be, but
Okay,
that doesn't
fast.
exist. So, at least at this point.
Yeah.
So, anyway, okay. So, moving on. Oh, sorry, I thought that was already on the screen. Okay, there we go. So, another thing that I found problematic about the design of the PHP, which actually makes sense for PHP, I think, although I think they could have still done it better, is a separations of concerns. They, for example, the original module here binds cookies and sessions directly into the library. It's using PHP's cookies and sessions. PHP has this as a built-in thing because it's a web server language, right? It's designed to do this stuff. So why not use their sessions and cookie management stuff that's already there and free, essentially? Have it all built in so you don't have to do any of that yourself, right? Well, the problem with that is that they do have to do that themselves because they also have a Drupal module, and they also have a WordPress module, and they also have other PHP-based modules. But none of them share a code base with each other because each one of them has their own session management stuff. Each one of the different things that they plug into has its own session management that is not PHP's session management, right? So by building this in here, they can't use this library to run their other code bases. If they built it without this in here, they could build their Drupal stuff on top of this library, right? And that's the problem. That's the bottom line. So in Perl, you know, Perl's not natively a web language. It doesn't natively have session management in it. It doesn't natively have cookies. You use a module that has those things. It might be that you get it from Dancer or Apache or something like that, you know, mod Perl. Or it might be that you write your own. Or it might be that you're using Cookie Jar from LWP to manage cookies, or, you know, who knows, you know. I can't rely on any of that because it depends on who is implementing this service and how they want to do it. So separation of concerns is paramount when it comes to us, but I think it would be useful to them too, even though PHP has this built-in functionality that they could use. So looking down the code base a little bit further in this same method, this is by the way the get key method or subroutine in the PHP library. So looking down this a little bit further, inside their stuff, they also deal with whether or not this is a guest user, whether you have to generate some sort of a login because the user isn't actually logged into your website, so you have to generate some sort of a fake login for this person to say, this is guest Joe, you know. You have to give them a temporary name until they do log in, if you want to allow guests. So they handle that directly in the get key module or method as well, which I think is is bad because you might want to deal with guests in a different way. You might want to segregate them to a certain area of your site. You might want to name them something else. You might not want to like this thing calls back to their server to get a random name that you could use. You know, you call it this time, it'll be Jenny, and the next time you call it, it'll be Bill, and the next time it's Bob. You know, and that's great. That's a very useful service because I'm sure they have a name database with 50,000 names in it, and you don't have to come up with those names. But if you want to, maybe you want to theme it to your site. You want names that are all steampunk related because you're running a steampunk site, right? Or you're running a motorcycle site, and so you want it to be, you know, different biker names or something. I don't know. But if you want to do that, you should be able to. Also, if you don't want to incur the cost of making a service call out to them, you should be able to avoid that too, because you want to keep your website humming along, right? And you don't want to rely on that extra call. So you might just have an array of names that you want to use, which will speed that up a little bit because it's just built into your code. So I don't like that they put that in there, so I separated that out too. I figured that was a separation of concerns issue. And then, so this is kind of how I did it. Breaking, you know, it's just a separate method. And this will call their web service the same way that their code did, but it's a separate method. This makes it testable. It makes it easy to read. It's just better. Same thing down here. If I want to generate an anonymous user from my own list of names, I can do that. And if I don't want to do that, it will still make that call out to making an anonymous, remote anonymous name. So, you know, that's all. I still have this exact same functionality they had. It's just that I broke it out. The other thing that this does by separating it like this means that if somebody were to create a subclass of my class, they can completely replace the functionality that I created with their own functionality to do whatever it is they want to do. So, anyway. So, just to reiterate, breaking apart get key into small pieces. First, you know, 90 lines became 21 lines. That's a huge savings, right? It fits, get key all of a sudden fits onto a single screen, whereas before 90 lines just doesn't fit onto a single screen unless you have a very large screen or a very small font. So it makes it easy to read, it's easy to test, it's easy to override in a subclass. These are all things that I already iterated, but you know, it's important to restate them because when you're designing objects, this is what you should be doing. And hopefully, everybody here has designed an object? Is there anybody that hasn't yet?
I haven't designed it.
You have not designed an object?
I have not designed it.
Steve, use all these principles when you design an object.
I'm paying very close attention.
Okay. Very good. Very good. So the next part was to deal with legacy code. The first thing is, how do you identify legacy code? Like, how do I know that this is actually vestigial, right? That's not used anymore. It's hard to know, right? So that's really the hardest part, and a lot of that comes down to reading everything line by line. Does this ever get called anywhere? That's a good first start. You can do a search. Does this name exist anywhere else in this code? If not, it's probably vestigial, right?
Or are the three switches that could cause this to get named ever turned to the right state?
That's another way to do it.
That can be a problem.
Yeah. Sometimes it is called elsewhere, but then you have to go, okay, the code that is calling this, does that get called anywhere else? No? Oh, well then that probably means this whole chain of things is legacy. So anyway, there's some stuff you can do. Like Dave said there, unused variables, unused methods, and again, even states of those variables. It's, you know, if this variable could be these three things, are all three of them useful? They all do something. It's tough to go through and do this. There might be features in there that are vestigial to you or your implementation. In my case, for example, because they have legacy users using this PHP thing, they have both an AJAX way of communicating and instantiating a user and a server-side way of doing this, like, or in a static page view. which will slow things down. If you're making all these calls back to their server while you're also rendering all the other crap that's going to go on your page, that will slow it down as far as the user is concerned. It's much better to make a separate call after the page has been instantiated, just to log them into chat. That way, what if the chat module never even gets loaded? Now I haven't done anything on my server side because the JavaScript failed anyway, so I don't need to log them in, right? So anyway, so I got rid of all that static crap because I figured that anybody that's doing any kind of implementation of this is going to want to do it in the fastest way possible. So I gave it one direct path because I understand why they have to do it for their user base that would break their sites. But Perl, nobody else is using this in Perl, so I can do the more modern way, which is clearly what they intend anyway. Otherwise, they wouldn't have it in there. So anyway, you have that. Oop. Missed one. And then some of them is features that have duplicates that work better. Again, this is a legacy code issue. It's they have to have this method in there because somebody might be using it in their code base somewhere. However, they have a newer version of it called, this _2, something like that, or new. In lots of web services, I've dealt with that before. Now, in this, I didn't find an instance of that in the iFly chat, but in lots of the web services that I've implemented, the wrapper for it, I've seen that happen. There's _2, _new, _better. I've seen. Faster is another one that I saw, or fast, I think it was. Yeah, there's this method name and this method name fast. So when you see that sort of thing, you can optimize that stuff out when you're translating, because you aren't supporting their legacy users, you're supporting a new code base, otherwise you wouldn't be writing this module. So anyway, optimizing for, modern. Okay, so I look around, they have this amazing list of features on their website. I can't access half of them. I have no idea what is going on. I thought that they wouldn't be switches, maybe. Maybe the thing is that once I get this thing up and running, all those crazy cool features will just happen even though there isn't a switch for them. And it turns out that was false. That is not the case. You do need to turn them on.
Tinkerbell didn't show up.
Yeah. So I'm like, well, crap. What do I do? How do I get these features? And I thought about contacting the author of this, but he lives in India, and at the time he was asleep when I was writing this. So I didn't want to wait for him to wake up so that I could ask him, because I was in the zone, So you want to figure this out. So then I'm thinking, how do you, if you know they have these features, but they're completely undocumented in the code sample that you have, how do you figure out how to use those features? You could do some sort of crazy reverse engineering thing, and I'm sure that's what Tim would do. But I'm not smart like Tim. So instead, I go, you know what? 90% of their users are Drupal users. So what if I go and get Drupal and figure out how Drupal uses these features? I'll bet I'll figure that out, because you go where the users are, you're going to find the stuff, right?
Is that so much less work than
What's that?
reverse engineering?
That is reverse engineering. That's how I'd do it.
That's not reverse engineering. That's just digging. So anyway, so the mental note here is the gold lies where the users are. All right. So if you find something that has a lot of users, that's the place to find all the good stuff. I went there, I started digging through the Drupal module, which was tough because, again, I've also not used Drupal before, except for as a user. I've not gotten into their code base before. And that was a little weird because the way you implement a Drupal module, apparently there are like 4 segments to it, so the module is actually split across 4 different files. So I had to keep referencing the files back and forth to figure out, okay, this switch goes to that function and that sort of thing. But once I figured out how that worked, it all made quite a lot of sense. And lo and behold, there was documentation in there too of this switch actually means this thing, because Drupal forces them to have it, because Drupal has these hover help things that are, you know, in there. They're tooltips in the display. So they filled out the tooltips, tooltip variables. And so that's how I got documentation for what this switch means. And the best part about that was a whole lot of the switches that I pulled out of the PHP library, there was no documentation for them. So I was just guessing based on the name of the variable, what did this do? And I was so wrong.
Yeah.
So
naming practice.
yeah, I was like, well, at first this is how I found out the difference between 1 and 2. I thought it meant true or false, but it didn't really mean true or false. In some cases it meant user, admin user, you know, that sort of thing. Or it would mean yes or no, but then there were these 3rd and 4th options that were yes or no, or yes under this circumstance. You know, that there were these extra things. So it was cool to see that sort of stuff. Anyway, so I was able to pull documentation for my own code out of the Drupal code just from their tooltips that were in there, and that was super sweet. So, you know, then I'm like, well, this Drupal code is cool. They have this PHP library, but why doesn't it use it? But it comes down to, you know, the separations of concern stuff that we already talked about. I think that would improve their stuff greatly. So that should be a lesson learned for everybody, is if you're writing stuff, you know, build on top of things. I will use a small little anecdote in my own world. A few years ago, I guess last year actually, I wrote a module for a credit card processor called iTransact, and I released it to CPAN, and I think when I released it and posted a thing to blogs.perl, I got like 16 or 20 people kind of yelling at me in the comments, why didn't you release this as a business online payment subclass module rather than just a standalone iTransact module? And my answer to them was, because what if you don't want to use business online payment and have a whole overhead? You can still use my module as the driver for a business online payment module, just wrap it. It's very simple, and then all of a sudden you've got, you know, your business online payment. But I'm not using business online payment. I don't want it to be pluggable. I don't care about any of that. I just wanted to get access to iTransact. So here's a very simple, lightweight plugin into iTransact. And that's where this really comes down to. If you separate it out and get just the little nugget, and then you layer on top of that nugget and build another layer on top of that nugget, then all of these other things get to use that nugget. And when a bug gets fixed here, it gets fixed in all of these things, right? And that's where the separation of concerns really comes in. By keeping all these little nuggets all wrapped up into their little things, you're able to reduce the amount of work that you have to do. And in their case, like I said, they're maintaining these modules for all these different PHP-based platforms, when they could just write a core module, and then each one of those uses that core module. So, anyway, done harping. PHP sessions, we already went through this. They're using PHP sessions, not Drupal sessions. The PHP library uses their config file rather than the Drupal settings, which are stored in the database. If it were built better, the PHP library could be used in Drupal. And the Drupal, another sideline kind of thing, and this might be why they didn't do it, is that Drupal has all kinds of extra management features that the PHP module doesn't have. So, because it has an admin console, you know, an admin interface, Drupal has. So that could be why they decided not to do that, but I still think at a foundation level, you have all that stuff. It's just that the Drupal module would have more stuff. So
It's probably mostly because the Drupal module came first.
sure, but then
So
wouldn't you
everything-
extract that out?
Well, I think very likely what they did is they pulled out, you know, a lot of pieces, but they had to get rid of all the Drupal stuff, and eventually it probably just kind of got hacked to bits.
I suppose that's true.
So, and like we said earlier, PHP didn't have namespaces until recently.
Yeah.
So,
Anyway, for all the, I've done a little beating up on iFlyChat tonight with this, library, and maybe to some extent beating up on PHP a little bit. That wasn't my goal, really. I just wanted to show you something that's very different from how I code to something how I code, and hopefully that will transcend into something that's usable in your daily lives as you write code, no matter what the language that you're writing it in. Using good practices will help you do these things a little bit better. Whether it is that you're translating something from one code base to another, or you're just building something from scratch. A little bit of planning goes a long way to making your life easier. So the final module that I released to CPAN is actually, I want to say it's something like 1,500 lines of code. Well, 1,500 lines, I should say. Which is actually quite a bit longer than the PHP code that they have. The reason is because my module actually has about 1,000 lines of pod. Took all that documentation from all of the stuff that I found in Drupal and put it in here. So I think that's useful too. It could be a useful starting point as documentation just for this whole service. If somebody else decided, hey, I think this service is really cool, I want to use it in Python or Ruby, hopefully my module will help them build that library in those other languages, because at least some module somewhere has some documentation about what all these switches mean. So I think that's a useful use case for it as well. Anyway, so I think not doing a direct conversion helped. Whereas if I was doing this in Java, if I was converting a Java library like I have in the past, oftentimes I do fairly line for line conversions of things, or Ruby especially, I've done that in. I don't do, in the past I haven't done this kind of abstraction that I did here where I went through all this stuff. But I actually, now that I've done it, feel like I should do that same process, even if it was well tested and well documented and well written in the other language. I should go through and not do a direct conversion, but actually go through this analysis process as I'm doing it, because it allows me to use Perlisms where possible, so that it's more, when you are reading the code or when you are using the code, it reads like Perl and uses like Perl rather than using it like Java. So I think that's a big thing. Another thing is that it allows you to potentially make smarter choices than the original author did. And smarter can be up for debate. Obviously they wrote it and maybe they had a good reason for doing it the way they did it. So maybe smarter, maybe it's just that I think it's smarter. But I feel like, doing this non-direct conversion, this indirect conversion, allowed me to make better choices.
At least you have the benefit of the work has been finished when you start.
Yeah.
So.
it makes a big difference.
Yeah, exactly.
You've got something, and you can take the best of it. They had to start out from scratch.
Exactly. And I often say that about my own code too. I hate everything I wrote yesterday. That's a common thing that I say.
So do I.
Same. Yeah.
Sorry.
It's because, every day I get just a little bit better at what I was doing, and now I'm like, God, I could have done that so much better if I was starting today. And it's the hindsight, what you just said. It's, when I wrote it before, I hadn't done it yet, so I made some mistakes along the way. So anyway, and then the other big thing was writing some tests against the original library to make sure that my code performs the same. I get the same output, even if I don't have documentation on how the stuff is supposed to work. As long as if I put in the same inputs, I get the same outputs, I can at least get to a working state that from there I can do some additional debugging, additional documentation, additional features, that sort of thing. So testing, while you should use that all the time, and I don't use it enough, honestly, testing in this sort of translation mode is just critical, because ultimately you want the same, given the same set of inputs, you want the same set of outputs as the original code. Otherwise, you know, the remote server will just barf at you. So that's it. Any questions, comments, or scathing rebuttal? Really? Silence? Crickets?
Well, I just want to comment on,
Okay.
I'm looking at your source code right now, and one of the things I just want to point out that I hope people appreciate and learn from is that JT does a great job of making attributes for like everything with the module. And that may seem kind of simple at first, but by exposing all these different parts of the module's attributes, if you don't like what he did, you can make your own wrapper and instantly inject your own attributes and values that you want on top of his with like no changes at all to his code. It makes it so easy. For example, like even something as critical as the HTTP client. I mean, it looks like all you're doing is calling request. So you can swap out HTTP thin with LWP user agent.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can set any additional properties on the LWP user agent you might be familiar with and use this module as is, and it'll just work. So but something that's really cool in the Perl community, and I'm sure in other languages they do that, but you see it so often that expose your attributes and now people can reuse your code without any pain in slightly modifying it to how they want. You know?
Yeah, you don't even have to subclass it. You can just literally inject, like you said, LWP user agent instead of HTTP thing.
Yeah.
If that's what you want to use.
So, yeah, kudos to you for keeping that trend going. It's something that if you bury that logic of like deciding which user agent to use inside of a routine that uses it, now you have to re-implement that method, which is doing that just to get at switching that. So you just expose that as an attribute, you can just get around it really easily. So.
Yeah.
I did not know until today that you can pass subroutine references to ISA in your Moose attributes.
I don't actually know if you can in Moose. It might be a Moo thing.
Oh.
It could be a Moose thing too. I don't know, because usually in Moo or in Moose you actually have this whole type system, and there isn't a type system in Moo. So I think in Moo you might have, or in Moose you might have to define a new type with that subroutine in it, because at least that's how I've done it in Moose before.
Yeah, you do.
Can you
Moo
pass in? But can you pass in a subroutine reference?
No, not in Moose.
Okay, you can't. So you have to define a new type in Moose.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's one of the two major differences in the has parameters, the ISA and default.
Yeah, default always has to be a subroutine reference in Moo, whereas in Moose you can just pass it a scalar. But in Moo, you can't pass it a scalar at all. Like even if you just want it to be 0, you have to pass subroutine reference 0. So.
Do you always use Moose, or Moo, rather?
No, I sometimes use Moose as well. I don't. In the last 5 years, I've completely stopped using, or maybe not even that long, maybe 3 or 4 years. I've stopped using Perl's native objects completely. I now use either Moo or Moose all the time. For a while, I was also using Mouse occasionally, but that's terrible. I've stopped using that. Mouse was a smaller version of Moose essentially, but it's really slow and crappy. If you're going to use something, use Moo. If you wanted a smaller thing, or Mo even. I haven't used Mo, but somebody said they were using it.
Yeah,
You use it?
Mo is it does not do
Roles, right? Does it do roles?
No, I don't think you can do roles at all with Mo. But the main thing you can't do with Mo is it will not upgrade objects or classes.
Oh.
That's the biggest thing about Moo, is if you write a library using Moo and it gets pulled into a system that uses Moose, it upgrades everything to Moose. So You end up just having the one object system. Mouse doesn't work that well. It's supposed to do something similar, but it doesn't. So I recommend Move. I try to use Move in everything unless I want metadata.
Yeah, I use, there's a web service framework that I wrote that we use in a lot of things called Wing, and that's all Moose because we use the meta object system of Moose a lot in that. But the only reason I use Moose is because I need that meta object system. Otherwise, if I don't need the meta object system, then I just use Moo because it's so much smaller and faster. It's it's just really small. So Moose is a very big, well, it's a moose, you know, it's huge.
Truth in advertising.
But it has a lot of power too, just like a moose would. It's just that, you know, if you don't need that, then Moo is a better choice, I think. And I also that's one of the things I hate about Moose. I don't often use ISA in Moose because it's such a pain in the ass to define a new type. I don't often use ISA, and that's a shame because that's a very powerful feature to have that there. But in Moo, I use ISA constantly because it's so easy to define a new type by just passing in a subroutine reference. Because often the new type that I want to use, I'll only use it once in a class, so it's really not worth implementing a whole new type just to, to set that up. So,
Now that I think about it, it seems like I read somewhere that there is like a parameterized type that you can just pass in a sub. I'll have to look at that. Because that would be really nice if we could just pass a sub and have it do the type check.
It would. Moose should start stealing features from Moo.
But then what would you call it?
It's still Moose.
It just would get bigger.
Yeah, it's just even bigger Moose. Mo Moose. Yeah. So any other comments, questions, or anything, or it doesn't even have to be about this. Does anybody have something cool they've done lately and they want to talk about it a little bit? Any projects, any modules that you've used recently that you thought were cool, or anything like that?
I've been trying to write plugins for WebGUI to post things to social networks. Well, we don't have to talk about Facebook Graph right now.
Isn't there? I thought I wrote a Facebook module for WebGUI a long time ago, didn't I?
For authentication.
Oh, it's just for authentication, right? You want to post stuff.
I need to post articles.
Okay.
Yeah, I mess with that too.
Okay.
With authentication for that reason.
Anybody else doing anything? Using any modules that you thought were cool?
Always.
Always?
I got to plug Develop Confess.
Okay.
Have you used that one recently?
I haven't.
So, I'm not sure how recent it is, but have you guys ever used a module like, there's a couple others out there like Carp Always or Develop Simple Trace? Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
So, like if your code warns or dies, it will wrap around that warning or dies and dump out a stack trace, so it's easy to find where that occurred.
CGI.
Yeah. So the thing that Develop Confess kind of opened my eyes to was that sometimes if you die with a structured exception, you're not going to get, or if you throw an exception, you're not going to get stack trace always, because it's not dying the same way that these other modules are looking for. And so Develop Confess takes care of that, and so even structured exceptions will dump out a stack trace. So if you need something that reliably will dump out a stack trace for your exceptions,
Dude, that's cool.
Develop Confess is the way to go. Plus, they also took care of. I think they took notes from Carp Always, which had a few plugins you could call them. So I didn't even realize Carp Always could do this until I was looking at Develop Confess and saw I could do it. But Carp Always had things like what they call it, dump. So you could load the dump plugin. And so when you got a stack trace and you had attributes passed to a subroutine, it would actually dump out those, parameters to that subroutine, and it wouldn't just show you like the hash memory location to where that attribute, that parameter was. So if you had a simple hash, you could actually see what that parameter was passed in summary, which is really nice. Or coloring, so if you wanted to see like exceptions in red, or dies in red, and warnings in yellow, you can see that.
That's pretty cool too.
Yeah, but then my favorite one is a context. So with context as the plugin turned on, and all these Carp Always and Develop Confess both have, but context, with every, I think frame you would call it in the stack trace, it'll give you 5 lines of context from where
Oh, cool.
that separate.
Oh, so we don't even need to go look up the
You don't have
code.
to look it up.
Oh,
2 lines above, 2 lines below.
that is
awesome.
badass.
And then in bright yellow, it shows you the line that it was. So it's super easy to use. So
Sweet.
the nice thing about Develop Confess is that all of these plugins I talked about are guaranteed to work because they're all under the same umbrella of the module. Whereas Carp Always had these different plugins that sometimes collide with each other. But the authors of Develop Confess took care of all that, so it all works together. So
That's really cool.
really, really slick.
Yeah. I think I'm gonna have to use that.
And so it's one of those modules where if you want to turn it on, all you have to do is say, like if you're running your Perl whatever script, just do Perl -M to say use this module, and then develop : confess, and you're done. It's on. So they even made a shortcut to say -D, which is the debugger flag, -D : confess as a shorthand, which will then also deploy. So that's really, really cool.
That is super sweet. I recently did this, wrote this new app at the Game Crafter for managing maintenance tasks. There's a lot of stuff that just needs to get done on a very regular basis. You know, this machine needs to be oiled every week, or this airline needs to be drained every 3 days, or somebody needs to clean the bathroom every day. Whatever needs to get done. Or there's some tasks that need to be done twice a year, and everybody forgets to do them because it's twice a year. So trying to figure out how to deal with write your own scheduling system essentially, because it needed to be tied in. There are certain events that can trigger some maintenance tasks that all of a sudden have to be done quicker than usual because of some service history on a machine or something like that. So I needed to tie in all this stuff. So I basically had to write my own calendaring system to pull this off, or so I thought. But I found a module called Datetime Event Duration? No, is it Recurrence? Datetime Event Recurrence. It's amazing. So what you do, it's built on top of datetime, as you might imagine, and what you can do is set up recurrence rules that, like, this has to happen on the fourth Thursday in December always. You can just set that, and it will every year. It will figure out what the fourth Thursday of December is. So you can then just have a little cron that runs every day. Every morning, it'll run this cron, and then if today is that day, it will fire off that event, right? And that's really, really friggin' cool, because trying to figure out on your own, doing the math every year to figure out what the fourth Thursday of December is, would be tricky. Or every third month. Every third month starting when? That's weird. Well, you can actually just pass in a date if you want a start point. So I can say, starting today, we know that every third month we need to do this thing, whatever that day is. So 15 years from now, it will still go, starting from, March, what is today? The 8th? 12th?
11.
Okay.
March 11th, starting from March
You've been busy.
11th, 2014. Sorry, yeah, I've been crazy. So starting from March 11th, 2014, 15 years from now, it'll know that every 3 months up to that point, and it does that math basically instantly, it'll know whether that event is supposed to recur on this date at that point, which I thought was just super handy to have that sort of thing. And you can even get sets to come out of this. So based on your recurrence definition, you can say, give me all the dates for the next 3 years that match this. So that's kind of cool too. Anyway, so I thought I'd share that.
I had kind of an abortive project that we were just talking about the is a attribute in Moose, And I've always been unhappy with the way of defining complex data structures in that. And I always thought you needed kind of a little mini language in there to kind of define it all out. And I found recently on Reddit there was a guy who posted QLang, which is kind of a way to define a mini language for defining all this out. So you can say, this is going to be an array. All the elements of the array will be a hash, and that hash will have a key of foo and bar. Foo will be an integer between 7 and 21, and bar will be a date or timestamp. So you can get really complex that way. It ended up being a little bit more complex of a project than I was anticipating, so I kind of cut it off. But if anybody's interested in that sort of thing, you might want to look into it and see if you can cook up an implementation.
That sounds pretty cool too. Anybody else? Show and tell. No. Okay. Well, again, as a reminder, next month Tim will be doing a talk on encryption, which is sort of a survey of various encryption systems in Perl, and then Dorothy will be doing a talk on Jenkins in May, and then we still have to figure out what's happening in June. So, but that's 2 months away, so we can worry about that later. So, Dorothy, Jenkins in May. 3 months away. 3 months.
Good thing you didn't write that.
Well, see, if I had daytime event recurrence, then, yeah. And then
You need a plug-in.
I do. I need a plug-in right here. Actually, I just need to sleep more. I've had in the last 3 days, I've had
Daylight savings.
6 hours of sleep maybe total. So I just need a little more sleep lately. But anyway, yeah. So with that, we'll call it. And thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.